our panelists have a very long and illustrious career. I will only briefly introduce them. Right next to me is Bertrand Buchwalter. He's advisor to President Macron, Continental Europe, and Turkey. Robin Brooks, former special advisor to Vice President Kamala on Europe and Eurasia. Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, and Yuliya Ziskina, Senior Legal Fellow at Razom for Ukraine. Let me remind you one more time, this session is not under Chatham House rule. It's live streamed, so you can say whatever you want. The whole world will hear you. And I would also like to remind you that at 11 o'clock we will pause for remembering the First World War. And I would like to mention that this was a coincidence, but rather a symbolic one, that on this Armistice Day we are discussing the gravest crisis this continent has faced in decades. Many commentators have drawn parallels between First World War and the war in Ukraine for its grinding attritional character and immense human cost. And others have cautioned against what may seem as simplistic historical comparisons. And as always, probably both perspectives have truth in them. Yet one lesson from 1919 is uncontested. The nature of the peace that follows. A war determines whether lasting stability is secured or whether the seeds are planted for the next conflict. The confrontation between Russia and the West today is not only about Ukraine's security arrangements. It concerns the future of Europe's security order and its strategic direction. For all intents and purposes, Russia is seeking to reshape that order. It is calling for a new division of the continent into spheres of influence. And this is precisely what Europe has spent more than 3 decades trying to avoid. And the question that follows, I think, is pretty obvious. If such a division were to take place, where would it leave Europe? As part of someone else's sphere of influence, or as autonomous political center capable of defending itself and shaping the political outcomes that affect it? Much of this is being determined today at the battlefields of Ukraine. Perhaps the more accurate question for our panel should have been to ask not whether Europe can defend Ukraine, but whether Europe can defend itself in Ukraine. This also includes confronting an increasingly pressing issue: to what extent can Europe still rely on the United States? Someone aptly adapted NATO's founding principle, saying that the objective in Ukraine is to keep Russia out, keep Europe engaged, and United States on call. And the question, of course, is how to do it. And I would like to start with you, Bertrand. Talk to us about Coalition of the Willing and what exactly this coalition is willing to do. What form European military presence can take in Ukraine, and at what stage of this war?
Thank you very much, Natalie. It's good to be here in London and good to be here with British and Ukrainian friends. And indeed, as you put it very eloquently, I mean, we are here on the 11th of November, and one can only think, like the minister just said, you know, about the lessons that we need to draw from our collective history. And so we're here, and there is a longing for peace, a peace that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people deserve, but not any peace. Like you said, a just and lasting peace, not a peace that will be the predicament of another war. And this is what we are. This is what we are focusing our energy on. This is what we've been focusing our energy from the very start of the war of aggression, of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. A war that was the choice of Russia, the choice of Russia only, and it is the choice of Russia to prolong it today. And there is an attempt, indeed, to resuscitate in Moscow a doctrine that was repealed at the end of the Soviet Union, the Brezhnevian doctrine, which should be something of the past, but there is this attempt, which is unacceptable, to have a say and to limit the sovereignty of Russian neighbors. In Ukraine, it takes a very brutal form, but we see it taking different shapes around Russia, and it is our duty, it is our responsibility to defeat this scheme and to support Ukraine, to support a solution that would preserve Ukraine's sovereignty, its capacity to defend itself. And Ukraine has a fundamental right that is not to live in the fear of another aggression. So our responsibility, and this is very much what we are trying to do within the coalition of the willing, is to create certainties for Ukraine, certainty also for our own European security, because they are inseparable. And to do this, we are determined to continue to double down on what would be a double agenda of further support to and increased support to Ukraine. I guess we'll have a chance to talk about the reparation loan. I'm not sure it is an apt word, reparation loan, but we've made some progress during the last European Council. I know it's the outcome of the European Council was not one that was the one that people would have wished, but I think we made progress, and I think we'll get there at the next European Council, because it is our responsibility to provide Ukraine with the visibility on our support, and it will be also a very strong signal to Russia that it cannot bet on our fatigue, that it will not it cannot bet on us tiring. Agenda of support to Ukraine, of support to Ukraine armed forces. I'll get there. Agenda of pressure against Russia. We already have a 20th package in the pipe of sanction package. We have taken bold steps at the last European Council. We continue to also to take decisive action against the shadow fleet, and there's a strong UK leadership on this issue, but we've also brought the issue to the attention of the CHODs, so that we should contemplate all the actions altogether to disrupt the functioning of this shadow fleet, which is the fuel of also of the Russian war economy. When it comes to the coalition of the willing, I very much remember all the debate that predated its inception, and I would date it back to I think a very momentous meeting that was convened in Paris on the 26th of February 2024. So we were already 2 years in the conflict, and the President Macron very much challenged us and saying, how do we break the linearity of this conflict? He had the understanding that we should do a lot more of the same, the things that we were already doing, and that we should amplify this agenda, but there was also a need for doing things differently. And that's also to show that we have a skin in the game. And that's what you'd remember probably at the press conference. That was the time when he refused to rule out anything. So back to the debate that we just had on whatever it takes. He felt, alongside with others, that we were too busy saying what we will not do, and that this was a grave mistake, and that everything needed to be on the table. And the coalition of the willing, I think, was born from this necessity to look at the things differently, to show that we have a skin in the game. And the first meeting convened in Paris a year after that meeting on the 26th of February, on the 17th of February, 2005, a few days after the first phone conversation, official phone conversation between President Trump and President Putin, was also born from this desire as Europeans to step up and to take our responsibility, to create options also, and to create also to steer the debate and the effort in a clear direction, that the solution will need to be backed up by strong security guarantees. And so the minister developed the work that we've been doing, support to Ukraine and Ukraine armed forces as the first line of deterrence, as the first security guarantee indeed of Ukraine, supports and putting together a multinational force with a OHQ which is based in Paris and which is running, and with planification that is running, so that in the event of a ceasefire, we provide an additional, what would be an additional layer of an additional guarantee of security. And the third main item on our plate is also how we enshrine this security guarantee in robust security arrangements, and where we draw the lessons also from the failures of the past, of the memorandum Budapest, and so that Ukraine doesn't live in the fear of a new aggression. Maybe I'll stop there. I'll say two last things to wrap up. One, that it is clear that the outcome of the war and the shape of the peace is first and foremost, obviously, a function of our Ukrainian friends, and I can only, like the minister, pay tribute to their fierce fight, but it's also a function of our own joint resolve. And the debate is also one that we shape. I will take only one example. When on the 26th of February, what the president said at the press conference was met with a lot of how would I say, doubts, or a lot of, and back then, if you were to quiz, if you were polling the French opinion about, the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine, French troops to Ukraine, you would probably have less than around 15% of people that would support this idea. Now we are in the waters of 48% of French people who would actually support. And the president has been very busy in engaging the public opinion, addressing also the wider audience in various formats, including on TikTok, also opening the eyes of with very simple words, of the wider public opinion in France about the threat posed by Russia. And the last thing that I wanted to say is also that, like many of you here, I have the occasion to go to Ukraine very frequently, and one can only be amazed by the fortitude of the Ukrainian people, but also this kind of energy that we see in Ukraine. The minister also talked about ingenuity, creativity, and once the war stops, I'm only very eager to see this energy channels through, putting the Ukraine and continuing to turn the country around and advance it to its European path and become a thriving member of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand. Lots of interesting points. Skin in the game for Europe and this regaining agency through coalition of the willing, because Europe's security should not be deciding elsewhere. I think that's important. And engaging public opinion, absolutely essential. The power of TikTok, I think we should all use it. But I have to ask you very briefly, if you can respond. It's a tricky question. Of course, there is one very predictable objection, right, to the coalition of the willing and to the deployment of European forces in Europe, in Ukraine, and that is Moscow. Putin will say there is no need to guarantee peace. If it's achieved, we will ensure that it is guaranteed. And for them, European troops in Ukraine is basically a backdoor entry for Ukraine to NATO. So how do you factor that in? Because this objection, as I said, is predictable. It will be there. And then related to this is also, how credible this force will be to have a deterrence effect. Because if it's not credible, if it's not large enough, then it may actually serve as an invitation for provocation. And Putin is known to take this kind of invitations.
Thank you. No, those are very valid questions. I think we've been, we can factor in, we can always try to factor in the position of Russia. And I think we've been there in the past. We've been in Istanbul 2022, where somehow there was an attempt to build something where the idea of security guarantee was predicated on the fact that Russia would have a say on those security guarantees, and obviously it's a dead end. You're not negotiating the security guarantee with the arsonist, or you're not protecting yourself. You're not insuring yourself from the aggression by negotiating this insurance with the aggressor. So this is a dead end, and we've always been crystal clear that those security guarantees were not to be negotiated with Russia. Of course, there is the risk, and because we know Russia's playbook, there is a risk of provocation. But those, and when we hear comments from quite high-ranking Russian officials that they see possible Western troops in Ukraine as a legitimate target, it is unacceptable, and it speaks volume also about again the playbook and the tendency that Russia has to intimidate and frame the debate. So the planning that we have put in place is cognizant of the fact that Ukraine is and will remain, Ukrainian armed forces will remain the first line of deterrence, and that's why we need to make our utmost so that they are in the best position to continue to defend their country. The multinational force that we will put together is an additional layer of security guarantee, and I said, I underlined the fact that it was an evidence that we would have a skin in the game, and that's really what matters eventually.
Thank you very much. Robin, let's move to you. And, we hear that any European plan for Ukraine is conditioned on two factors. One is Ukraine's will and capacity to continue fighting at enormous cost, and another is US support. Call it backstop. There are different names. So you can tell us maybe what this backstop is. But I would like to ask you more. You've served with the previous administration, worked closely with Vice President. How US support evolved from past to current administration? And does it envisage a common vision for the end game, or these are different visions?
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thanks, Bertrand, for your framing remarks. And thank you very much to Chatham House for organizing this important conference, and to all of you for being here. I think it's regrettable that there isn't a member of the current US administration here, because I think, Natalie, as you point out, the US backstop and the US role has been so important so far and will continue to be And it would be useful to know what U.S. policy actually is. But I'm very pleased that this gives me the opportunity to be here. And I think we do need to sort of understand the historical context of the past 4 to 5 years before we can talk about the current administration's policy. When the Biden-Harris administration came into office in 2021, we were faced with a couple of really big challenges on the European continent, and one of them was to try to rebuild our relationships with the United States as traditional allies and partners, and also to heal a rift within Europe itself between East and West that stemmed from some of the actions of the prior administration. One of the first things that we had to do was enforce the Protecting European Energy Security Act, PISA, which meant to impose sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And it was very difficult for us to convince our partners and allies in Europe that this was important. I would point out that this is an act that was passed by Congress during the first Trump administration, and it was very much the right piece of legislation, maybe for the right reasons, maybe not. But it fell to the Biden-Harris administration to enforce it and to bring the first sanctions packages under PISA against entities engaged in building Nord Stream 2. It was very difficult for us to convince Germany in particular, but also many of our European allies, that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was going to bring needed energy into Europe, was actually a hybrid attempt to circumvent Ukraine and make possible a future invasion of that country by Russia. Once we convinced Germany, the pipeline already didn't exist, which made that a little bit easier. The next thing that we had to do was share intelligence with our European partners and allies about Russia's plans, about the fact that the buildup of weapons and personnel on the border with Ukraine wasn't just about a normal day-to-day military exercise, but it was in fact a predecessor to an invasion. And this again was very difficult to convince our allies on the eastern flank as well as our allies in Western Europe of the importance. And whichever group of allies we were speaking to, we would get, some version of either this, let's just wait and see, or if the invasion happens, it will take 4 days and it'll be over, so it's really not such a big deal. This presented a challenge for the United States as a country far away on a different continent that wanted to support Ukraine and wanted to support our NATO allies with an ironclad commitment to Article 5. But we were the ones saying there's an invasion being planned close to the eastern flank that could impact European security, and a difficulty convincing our allies that this in fact was a challenge that we needed to face together. Once the invasion happened, through an iterative and transparent process, the United States interagency started talking about what needed to be done and how to bring our European allies and partners along. And the first thing we started talking about was creating humanitarian assistance hubs, knowing that the civilian population of Ukraine was going to be deeply impacted and that could cause, first, significant human suffering, and second, a security challenge for NATO countries, as so many people had to flee Ukraine to get away from the aggression and seek refuge inside Europe and inside NATO countries. And we faced some pushback from some of our NATO allies because even the humanitarian hubs were perceived as potentially escalatory or a potential target of Russia. Much less when we started talking about the need for security assistance and security assistance hubs, getting countries of Europe, in particular some on the eastern flank, which have legitimate fear of retaliation and escalation from Russia, and whose airspace and water space and territory is even today being constantly tested by Russian forces. But we faced difficulty convincing these partners that it was time for them to provide the assistance that Ukraine needed, because that was assistance to eastern flank security and to NATO's very own security. And then we had to, a year in, we had to bolster our partners and allies as fatigue set in, as equipment dried up, and as even humanitarian assistance became something that affected the economies of, in particular, Eastern Flank, and then later, due to energy security issues, Western European and UK partners and allies. So the Biden administration was faced with these challenges as we tried to bring Europe along to understand that Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine was, in fact, a challenge to NATO's own security. Nonetheless, the Biden-Harris administration had a deliberative whole-of-government process that we used to come up with ideas for the next thing that we were going to do. And sometimes I'll acknowledge the UK ended up leading by saying, we're just going to give Storm Shadow. The US is too slow on this. We're just going to do it. And that turned out to be a really good thing. But we had an iterative process. We brought along allies in the form of first the Quad, then sometimes the B9, which is the 9 Eastern Flank NATO allies, then the whole of NATO. Then we'd bring in Switzerland, and Sweden and Finland chose to join NATO at this time, not as a provocation to Russia, but because they were concerned about the threat to their own sovereignty, territorial integrity, and their values by Russia's clear disregard for international norms and its obligations. And the US approach was always informed by the mantra, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So asking Ukraine what it needed, and then iteratively deliberating on how to provide those things. Unfortunately, however, throughout this entire process, as some of the speakers before me have pointed out, there was a constant fear of escalation and potential Russian nuclear retaliation that sometimes slow-rolled the process, as a consequence of which I will acknowledge, as a former member of the Biden-Harris administration, that our policy wasn't fully successful, as evidenced by the fact that the war is still going on today. We also, together with our European partners and allies, had sort of a paralyzing fear of being accused of domestic interference in Russia if we were to support the provision of information to the people of Russia, provide support to civil society within Russia, and even up until the end of the Biden-Harris administration, support prisoners of conscience, political prisoners like Navalny in Russia, who were simply trying to communicate with the population of that country. And that's one reason it took us until now for the United States to impose the biggest and most important sanctions package on Russia's oil and gas principles. But I'll say at least there was a process. There was a deliberative, whole-of-government, iterative process to consider Ukraine's requests and needs, our European allies' requests and needs, and to provide, to the extent that we could, the equipment that was available in light of other readiness concerns that the United States had in the European and other theaters. But throughout that process, we sometimes struggled to bring along our European partners and allies, and also those within the US government, and in particular in Congress, who had concerns about retaliation or about what the blowback effects would be on the US economy. So that brings us to what is the current US policy on Ukraine. And again, I do wish that there was someone here from the administration to tell us. We can read the tea leaves, and I think we've seen, and many pundits have talked about, the sort of back and forth, the whiplash, the confusion about what the policy might be. I've talked to a lot of people in the past couple of weeks before coming here, and here's what I think. I think it is very clear that President Trump wants this war to end for many reasons. I think he is probably concerned about the human suffering and wants the war to end for that reason. He also has made clear that he wants his legacy to be that of a peacemaker, a deal maker who finds a resolution to conflicts wherever they are in the world. But it's also clear that the Trump administration is sort of agnostic on the end state, what that peace will look like. So we have gone through a number of offers and iterations that we hear about through the media or after conferences or phone calls. It could be related to territory. It could be related to critical minerals. It could be a freezing of the lines of the current line of contact, or it could be population or territory transfers. The administration appears to be agnostic. And so it will be up to Russia and Ukraine to decide what that is. In a negotiated peace, that's always the case. But I think, as many have said on this stage before me, it is really important that Ukraine go into those negotiations in the strongest possible position, because Ukraine, after all, is the country that was invaded in a violation of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Trump administration also very clearly has other concerns in the world and wants to pivot to Asia, wants to fulfill its military contracts in other parts of the world, which present a challenge to fulfilling contracts or orders from Ukraine and from NATO allies. And it's also, the administration is also motivated by a seeking of fairness, or a seeking the desire for Europe to do its share. So the emphasis on 5% of GDP for military spending is I think, persistent and is going to persist into the future. The Trump administration's policy, both in Ukraine and globally, is one that appears to be transactional and based on deals, where the administration wants to preserve investment opportunities for American investors. It wants to preserve access to critical minerals in this theater and globally, and other extractives, and also a sort of, and this can be confusing, a desire for some sort of tit for tat. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. It's hard to predict what that will be on any given day, and I think the Trump administration's policy often is driven by who was the last person to speak to the president. So there's really no iterative plan, there's no process, there's nothing that's transparent. There's a small circle of people who are engaged. Not all of them are in every meeting. Decision making is then top down, and it is based on who was the last person to speak to the president. Somehow, though, we got to sanctions on Gazprom and Lukoil, and that's really important. Enforcement of those sanctions will matter, so I'm really glad to hear from my French colleague that the European Union, and I think also hopefully the UK, will look at the shadow fleet, will look at secondaries, will ensure that sanctions evasion is more difficult, and that the cost to Russia of continuing to sell that oil and gas is higher. And then it will be important to respond to Zelensky's request for a consistent and reliable source of funding for the needs that we've identified in the Pearl, the Prioritized Ukraine resource list, of equipment that they need on a monthly basis, which means using those sovereign assets, which I think Russia already recognizes are no longer theirs. So it's not escalatory at all in any way to use these assets at this point to finance the monthly procurement that Ukraine needs to be able to conduct and win the war that it's currently in. And also at the same time, we can't forget to be looking into the future at the need for a credible deterrent in the long run to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty, because Ukraine's sovereignty is a bellwether of that international norm of sovereignty that we need globally. And that sovereignty also includes Ukraine's right to decide what treaty organizations it joins and whether or not it wants to apply for EU membership. And a credible path to accession will be very useful in both deterring further aggression, but also in building up Ukraine's economy so that at the end of the war we have a successful, stable, and prosperous Ukraine as opposed to a failed state on Europe's eastern flank. And then I just want to respond in closing to a couple of things that I heard, and maybe Natalie's questions at the beginning of my remarks. The countries of Europe and the UK, I think, are in fact watching very closely what the US is not doing, and has an obvious investment in what the US will do to support both Ukraine and NATO through Article 5 and otherwise. But there also, I think, is a growing awareness within Europe that this continent is somewhat unprepared for Russian hybrid attacks that are ongoing. And I don't just mean the buzzing of airspace with drones, but also interference in electoral systems, interference in the media, and the spread of propaganda. And a disillusion throughout the Western world with democracy and the West that is demonstrated in elections throughout Europe over the past year. That is something that we need to address together, and that it's regrettable we did not address sooner. With that, I'll answer any questions.
Yeah, just very quick question for you. I want to pick up that point you said that President Trump is largely agnostic about the outcome. And also about sort of fair burden sharing with Europe. So, I mean, I'm just thinking it's clear that he is someone who is more inclined to do fast deals rather than follow through the process. But any kind of deal can lead to worse outcomes, right? We've mentioned that if there is a deal, for example, Ukraine can't take it anymore and has to accept a bad deal, that leaves Europe exposed, right? So for the United States, undermining European security must be consequential, right? So how do we convince President Trump that it matters what kind of outcome we see at the end of this war and talks? And also, I mean, I know that the process is very difficult. It is important now that Europe, and we've heard, is investing in its security, expanding military industrial production. And that is, to a degree, thanks to very clear messages from President Trump. Part of the problem is that it is not clear to Europeans how much, to what extent is the US withdrawing from its commitments. I mean, I think it's okay to do it, to rebalance, but it should be, I mean, we've said that he's not very big on process, but somehow it should be made clear how Europe prepares itself for how much of the US presence with the pivot, and I think even under Biden administration, the pivot was already on its way. So there are like two parts of the question.
So I don't think that the U.S. is backing off of its commitments, and I think that the U.S. commitment to Article 5 remains intact and will remain intact. But I think it is critical for Europe, and in Europe I include the U.K., to articulate its vision for the future, because there is no process in the United States whereby we would develop that vision. And so if Europe puts forward a vision, it is very likely that a pivoting US will simply support and follow with enablers. And I think that some members of the US administration have made clear that the US is prepared to provide those enablers to European boots on the ground in Ukraine if those were to happen, and that the US remains committed to Article 5. In terms of equipment, if the sovereign assets were seized or turned into some sort of loan that could be used to purchase American equipment, the one thing that we do in fact have in the United States is a defense industrial base capable of producing a certain amount of equipment, right? And whereas we used to be willing to donate that equipment to Ukraine and now we would sell it, the equipment is still available. Europe is now scaling back up and reinventing its defense industrial base, which is useful and will be very important after the war to provide that credible deterrent and to fulfill those contracts that a free and at peace Ukraine will inevitably have at the end of the war. So this shouldn't be perceived as a competition, I think, in any way, but right now the opportunity is for Europe to lead on what the end state looks like. And that leads me back to your first question, which was, what does that end state look like, and is there a danger that Trump would be too hasty? And I think President Trump sees himself as a deal maker, and he has many in his administration who see themselves in the same way. And there is, there is the danger that he will receive a phone call from Putin demanding some things in response for a ceasefire or an end to the war. And it is critical that Europe stand with Zelensky and insist on something that will be sustainable, whatever it is, right? The two countries themselves will have to negotiate an actual end to the war. So the fact that the United States or Europe or NATO or anyone else would mediate those discussions doesn't erase the fact that the two sides right now don't have a common vision for what that end state is. And the question is, who will pressure Russia in particular to back off some of its demands that would violate Ukraine's sovereignty in the post-war period. So to guarantee that Ukraine has the right to a credible deterrent, has the right to a defensive military, and has the right to join alliances or organizations that it wishes to do.
Thanks a lot, Robin. That leads me nicely to you, Sir Lawrence. So we talked about the evolution of the US policy, and Moscow has also adapted, right? It's moved from nuclear intimidation under Biden to sort of performative engagement with Trump administration. And it's also interesting how Russians underline, they talk about administrations. They very rarely now refer to the United States or Washington to show the sort of difference. And the focus of animosity has somehow moved to Europe in this, diplomacy of flattering President Trump. So I want to ask you to focus on President Trump's Ukraine policy. And one thing is clear, that he did bring diplomacy back into picture, right? So how would you evaluate this diplomatic triangle of Trump, Putin, Zelensky? And also Europeans and UK in particular, are they shaping this diplomatic process from the backstage, perhaps?
Thank you. It's challenging enough trying to make sense of what President Trump is doing, trying to make sense of what President Putin is doing as well. Complicated even more. But we have to, because this is Putin's war, and Trump has believed that he's the man who can do a deal with Putin. And if you I don't believe in trying to make sense of what's going on. There's much alternative but to read what people say and and how they present themselves, Putin as well as Trump. And you can see certain themes keep on coming through. So as it's the case that Trump vacillates a lot, and it's certainly true that it often seems to be very influenced by the last person he spoke to, nonetheless there are certain themes that come through. One, that the war in some way was Biden's fault, that he would have stopped it. He doesn't say how. But part of that, I think, is that he would have persuaded the Ukrainians in some way not to fight as much as they did, because he wouldn't have given them the resource that they got. Secondly, that it's Europe's responsibility. I'm following what Robin said here. Third, that he can do a deal with Putin. But fourth, this starts with a ceasefire. And that's where the problems for Trump's diplomacy really began. If you go back to that awful meeting at the end of February in the White House, it's clear at that point the administration figures believed that the obstacle to a ceasefire was Ukraine. That Ukraine, despite all the suffering, all the losses, all the advantages Russia had, was doggedly trying to fight, and if only accepted the logic of the situation, ceasefire now, no NATO, it would all be okay. And the critical moment came after that meeting when Zelensky said, oh, we agree with the ceasefire. And that put the onus onto Russia. And there's been a gradual logic working through since that point of Trump accepting that Russia is not giving him what he thought. And if you look at, again, at what he says in a number of the meetings, he makes claims for what Putin is prepared to concede that almost immediately lead Peskov to rush to the microphone to explain, no, we don't have that in mind at all, because he's creating a continual problem for Putin, which is he's creating expectations about Russian concessions, which Russia has no intention of giving. And that is, and every time Witkoff goes to Moscow, you get another iteration of this, where Witkoff believes he's heard something positive. This gets magnified when he talks to Trump, or when Trump talks to Putin, and then it turns out there's no concession there at all. And this, I'm not the only one to have likened it to those Charlie Brown fans of Lucy holding the ball and whisking it away as Charlie's about to kick it. So it's been a very curious process to watch in that sense. Now, why is Putin not taking advantage of Trump? It's his best chance. It's his best chance of a deal when he's got Trump. And I think we have to understand the mindset of Putin in all of this. I don't think there's a lot of discussion of Russia, so I'll just say in this conference, I'll just say a few things. One, Putin is absolutely convinced that Ukraine should be part of Russia. This is not a tactical thing, it's an absolute core belief. Secondly, he's got himself in a real problem, because if after all this time you end up with a ceasefire, the question of what was this all about is going to be pushed very hard. This is a failure so far. Instead of whatever the issues were about the enlargement of NATO, NATO has now got two extraordinarily significant partners, members again with Sweden and Finland. It was about the demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine is now one of the most militarized states in Europe and will remain so. It was about the subjugation of Ukraine. Ukraine is not subjugated. To a degree, it was about territory. And if perhaps he concentrated on Donetsk and Luhansk, we'd have different conversations now. But he added in September 22 Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. And that created an even bigger problem, because he's annexed them. They're part of the Russian constitution, but he doesn't control them. He controls a lot of them, but not them completely. So he's created a situation where a ceasefire is a loss. It's a failure. And it's not great for Ukraine. I mean, none of this is to say this is an ideal outcome for Ukraine, but it's a bad outcome for Russia. And if you think about it, winning the war or ending the war with a depopulated, economically inactive, bombarded, battered bit of Ukraine, without the confidence that Ukraine will not have revanchist objectives of its own in the future, is not a win. And that's why, and that incompatibility between the Trump and Putin perspectives, well, I think was evident from the start, but it's just taken time to work itself through. So I think this doesn't lead necessarily to a hopeful prognosis, because I think it is very difficult for Putin to agree an end to the war on the terms in which we've spoken. And we have to keep in mind that a ceasefire is not a simple thing to negotiate. It's easier than a full political settlement, which would be a horrendous thing to negotiate. If you just think of the number of issues that would be involved. But it's got harder rather than easier, simply because when we think about a war ending on the line of contact, we've got a war at the moment where there is no clear line of contact, where there are different claims made regularly about whose troops are where. I mean, we'll just look at Pokrovsk at the moment, but it's not just there. It's complicated, and it would be even more complicated to agree where it was. My suspicion is that if Putin comes to the view that he needs out, and I don't think that's impossible. The Russian economy is moving into recession. They still have inflation. The oil economy has been badly hit, and the combination of the American, European sanctions and Ukrainian attacks should not be underestimated. My guess is that it would be the deal that Witkoff thought he had heard, but hadn't really, which is give us Donetsk, we've got Luhansk, but you can have back Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. I think that's very difficult for Russia, even then, because of the Crimea link. But that I think is probably about as far as I could imagine, and I don't particularly see it round the corner. Or else you have some event that really shakes Moscow, or potentially in the other direction that really shakes Ukraine. This means that we carry on. Now, I think for Europe, this has a number of implications, and I just state two. First, the coalition of the willing, which I think is a good concept, and it has deterrent credibility. I don't think we should underestimate what it offers. But as something that only comes into play once there's a ceasefire, it's a good idea in waiting. It doesn't actually, it solves a problem which people believed was going to be the problem in February of this year, but doesn't quite seem to be the same problem, which is that Trump would agree a quick deal, which Ukraine would be under a lot of pressure to accept, without NATO, which Trump was quite explicit about, and therefore no security. How do you deal with that problem? So that's the problem it was designed to solve. It's not necessarily the immediate problem. Secondly, the diplomacy is very difficult. Now, in the past, Europe took the lead on the diplomacy. It wasn't the Americans. Now, looking back, we can question the Normandy format and Minsk and what it produced, because it produced fudges which just aggravated the situation over time. But there's no particular reason, if Europe is doing the heavy lifting increasingly on the financial and military side, why Europe shouldn't be doing more on the diplomatic side. But that requires much clearer formulations of our own, with the Ukrainians, obviously, about what will work and what won't. And there's the technical side of things rather than the big principles, because I'm not convinced the US administration has got the capacity to actually work through a lot of the complexities of a negotiation. And you can see some of the difficulties, even with, in some ways, the simpler Gaza ceasefire. So it's not just a question of what are the basic principles of the deal, it's a question of the practicalities of the negotiations, and the issue of what the role of Europe could come in through a different direction, not quite the same as the coalition of the willing, in those circumstances. And we're dealing with contingencies that are very fuzzy at the moment. So I think the Europeans have to be prepared to play a greater diplomatic role. It seems to me logical if we're doing more of the heavy lifting elsewhere. The other point is, and this I think was, Bertrand mentioned the famous press conference of Macron. And Macron, then I was thinking just how difficult the situation looked for Ukraine at that point. We forget. I mean, there's been some really tough times, and I think currently is a tough time as well. But a point where US Congress had withdrawn support, effectively. There was no guarantee when the votes would come through for the supplemental bill. When Ukraine was outgunned 10-1, when it had just lost Avdiivka, and people were expecting Pokrovsk to fall quite quickly after that, it produced a sort of clarity. Well, if we say we think Ukraine must be supported, whatever it takes now, rather than just how long it takes, how far are we prepared to go to make sure that Ukraine is not overrun? Now, I think it's highly unlikely that Ukraine will be overrun, but there are issues that come up, including with regard to air defense and potential no-fly zones, which, looking back, it might have been a good idea if they'd been agreed when Ukraine first asked for them in the first weeks of the war, of the full-scale invasion. Those issues could come back, and a lot of the work that's been done on the coalition of the willing is relevant to that. Particularly, I'd say, on the maritime and on the air side. The land side, I think, will be more difficult. So I think we've moved from the point where we're looking for all the answers from Washington, because we're not going to get them. I'm not convinced we're going to get the peace diplomacy from Washington, just because it's difficult, not because Trump doesn't want it. And therefore, the more Europe accepts that the fate of Ukraine is the fate of Europe, the more I think it's going to have to go into areas where it hasn't been prepared to go up to now. And at the very least, we've got to think about it and start thinking it through.
Thanks a lot. I am conscious of time, so I will move to Yuliya, but there is something I want you to think about, perhaps pick it up during the question and answer. It was very striking the way you described the complexity of this diplomatic process. And, on the one hand, you have Putin, who is convinced that Ukraine is or should be part of Russia, or it shouldn't be at all. And the strategy is to dismember it and make it unviable. And on the other hand, obviously, you have Ukraine, which is fighting for its survival. So we want to negotiate about something that is non-negotiable. And so the challenge really is to bring it, and can either Europeans or Americans create the kind of process that breaks this down, takes it out of non-negotiable categories into some practicalities, and maybe tries to secure a peace on the ground. But perhaps you can reflect a little bit on this. But I would like to move to Yuliya. And Sir Lawrence mentioned, protection, air defense, perhaps it would have been a good idea some time ago. And I feel like, we're talking for so long about repurposing of Russia's frozen assets. And once we get there, perhaps we'll say, well, would have been a good idea to do it earlier, probably. But the consensus is somehow edging. I think we're getting there. It took a long time. It is very important part of support for Ukraine, but also would you say, is also an aspect of deterrence and a strong signal to Russia. And can it have a real impact in terms of where this war is going?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for that question. So first, I want to give you a bit of background about the sovereign assets and where this plan stands now. A bit of a crash course, if you will, because I think it's important to understanding how it works to know where it stands and what the roadblocks currently are. So yes, in response to Russia's full-scale invasion, Western nations froze about 290 billion euro Russian state assets worldwide. About 2/3 of that amount is held at Euroclear, which is a central securities depository in Belgium. The cash in Euroclear mostly comes from Russian sovereign bonds that have matured. Normally, Russia could withdraw that money, but sanctions obviously prevent it from doing so. Over 98% of those original bonds at Euroclear are now in cash, roughly 175 billion euro. This cash, unlike the original bonds, can be used or lent out as long as Euroclear can repay Russia if sanctions are lifted for any reason. So with that context, the EU is currently negotiating what it calls the reparations loan, which is a proposal by the European Commission. Under this plan, the EU, or a coalition of participating states, would basically do a swap with Euroclear. In return for that cash, the EU would issue some sort of debt instrument to Euroclear. We can think of it as an IOU. Euroclear would keep that IOU on its books, and Russia's account at Euroclear would remain unchanged. It would show the same balance, and Euroclear's overall assets would also stay constant. The Russian cash would simply be replaced by an EU-issued debt, and Russia's claim to that money would remain in place. So in that way, this is not confiscation, it is not seizure, it is not transfer, or any of those words that you would like to use. We can go into the legal technicalities of what each of those mean. I'm happy to do that. The EU would then use this cash to repay existing loans that it has lent to Ukraine, such as the ERA loans, and then to issue new zero-interest reparations loans, which would be about 140 billion euro over 3 years. Ukraine would only repay those loans if Russia one day pays reparations to Ukraine. And so Ukraine would use that money to repay the EU. Once Russia pays reparations, which is a central but certainly not a guaranteed assumption of this plan, the EU would lift sanctions and Russia could recover its frozen funds. Euroclear would have the money to repay Russia, which completes that circle. However, nobody knows what will happen if Russia refuses to pay reparations, which is incredibly likely given that it has never paid reparations in its history, or the war continues indefinitely. So that brings us to what are the roadblocks? Well, there has almost been agreement at the most recent October Council meeting, but Belgium continues to oppose the plan because of several concerns. One crucial unsolved problem is actually keeping the funds frozen. EU sanctions must be renewed every 6 months with a unanimous vote, which continuously risks a Hungarian and Slovakian veto. If the sanctions lapse, Russia would withdraw its money, and Euroclear would have to immediately honor that obligation and send the frozen funds back to Russia. So because of that risk, Belgium wants whatever debt instruments the EU provides to Euroclear in exchange for that cash to be as good as that cash so that it can immediately repay Russia in case sanctions fail. And so far, the Commission has not provided clarity on that point. A second major issue for Belgium is the mutualization of risk. If sanctions fail, or if the war ends and Russia somehow gets out of its obligation to pay reparations, that means Ukraine won't have the money to repay. So then who does? And right now, the plan doesn't specify how that burden would be distributed. Relatedly, Belgium and Euroclear are also seeking indemnities against the legal risk that they take on through keeping the funds frozen and also for this new plan. Russia has repeatedly threatened lawsuits. It is quite unlikely that any of those could be won by Russia, but Belgium insists that the EU provide legal and financial cover for it. And so I'll pause here a little bit and say that it's worth noting here that the interest earnings related to Russian assets, which are subject to Belgian corporate tax, generated 360 million euro for the Belgian state in just the first quarter of 2025. Euroclear also already collects billions of dollars for itself as a litigation buffer, supposedly for these very lawsuits. And on top of that, Euroclear has also kept about 4 billion euro in interest generated on the assets from 2022 to 2023, before the interest was collected to Ukraine, which is 4 billion that could and should go to Ukraine. So I just wanted to put that out there, especially in the context of indemnities. So make of that what you will. Regardless, these issues need to be resolved by the next council meeting on December 19th. Ukraine faces a $65 billion funding gap for 2026 that needs to be resolved one way or another, and it is coming down to the wire. But assuming this loan scheme moves forward, this leaves open the question of how the funds should be allocated. The European Commission's current proposal is for most of the funds to go towards defense and a smaller share for Ukraine's budgetary needs, which could also be used to buy American-made weapons. Ukraine's position is that the loan, yes, must prioritize defense, urgent reconstruction, especially energy infrastructure, and also that the funds go towards compensation through the future international compensation mechanism. At the EU level, there is almost no mention of using the reparations loan for compensation or for reparations. Ironically, despite the name, it has very little to do with actual reparations. So, in short, the EU reparations loan is a critical measure, and it gets necessary money to Ukraine fast so that Ukraine can survive and keep defending itself and the rest of Europe. But let's be clear, it does not make Russia pay. This is an exchange with Euroclear, not with Russia. Russia's balance in Euroclear remains intact. The assets are not seized, and no legal responsibility is imposed on the aggressor. And in fact, this mechanism fundamentally avoids making Russia pay, despite the rhetoric that frequently accompanies it. And I want to bring that up because that distinction matters in terms of accountability and deterrence. Although the loan mechanism is an urgent necessity, keeps Ukraine in the fight, it is not a substitute for Russia's absolute and unavoidable responsibility for full compensation under international law. So apart from the funds in Europe, the UK holds an estimated 20 to 25 billion pounds, although that number has never been disclosed, unfortunately. The UK and Canada are expected to join the reparations loan mechanism. Japan has the equivalent of 28 billion euro, but its position on this is unclear. The US has about $5 billion in frozen Russian state assets, although potentially more. It's been reported that the US supports this scheme, but it seems unlikely that it would join it. So that said, the US situation is a bit different. The US has a law called the Repo Act, which directly authorizes the president to repurpose Russian sovereign assets. It was passed in 2024, in April 2024. Biden did not implement the Repo Act before he left office, which was a huge missed opportunity. However, there is still very strong bipartisan support in Congress for repo. There are currently 2 bills in Congress that, if passed, would potentially implement the Repo Act by directing that the Treasury, instead of the president, seize and repurpose those funds. And both of these bills passed in their respective committees by near unanimous bipartisan votes. So yes, the situation in the US is absolutely unpredictable, but if these bills are successful, the US would potentially become the only country to directly use Russia's frozen assets for Ukraine. Even though the sum is smaller, the signal that the aggressor must pay would be powerful. And so with that, in closing, the costs are existential, and there are only 3 realistic ways to close the $65 billion funding gap for Ukraine in the next year. 1, the reparations loan. 2, outright seizure of frozen Russian state assets. Or 3, direct contributions from EU and national budgets that are already under strain. Because outright seizure is politically off the table for certain reasons, and Europe's fiscal space is shrinking, Europe will put itself in a very unwelcome position if it doesn't agree to this reparations loan in December. But still, we should be clear-eyed, in that yes, the reparations loan is urgently necessary, Europe needs to do it, but outright seizure is still the gold standard. And what do I mean by that? As long as Russia retains its legal claim over the assets, there is a risk of those assets going back to Russia, especially in the context of a Hungary and Slovakia veto. That would be a catastrophic failure for Europe. Europe will have given Russia a giant bailout at its own expense that would allow it to continue the war for years to come. The only way to end this war, I would argue, on favorable terms for Ukraine is to make sure that Putin knows he will never have the means to continue it. And the only way to do that is for Russia to lose its legal claim over the billions of dollars in frozen assets. In other words, asset seizure. Asset seizure is therefore both a restorative and a preventative measure in terms of deterrence. The reparations loan, which is indispensable as it is at this moment, should be seen as a bridge towards full accountability and to a future where frozen assets are used as a matter of law and principle and not mere political contingency. So I hope I've added some nuance and some dimension to this topic.
You certainly did. Thank you very much. And very good. And it's very clear that reparation loan also is something that makes Belgians particularly worried, because they think that they might be the ones to carry the repayment burden, and it needs to be shared. And your mentioning of Hungary and Slovakia, I think, is very important, because they also claim to have a say on how the funds will be spent. But let's open to questions. I will put my glasses on so I can see. We start with Tim here. I will collect around 3. Please present yourself and be quick.
Sure. Tim Ash, Ukraine program at Chatham House. Actually, it's a question for Robin, really. I mean, you were part of the previous administration. I mean, the frozen Russian asset thing has been going on for 3 years. We've been lobbying and pushing. Could you perhaps tell us why it wasn't done under the Biden administration? Because that would probably tell us or explain why all the problems that we're currently having with in Europe around those kind of issues. I mean, what were the key considerations for not doing it, and debates within the Biden administration around that issue? Because I think the US could have really led. You know, if the Biden administration said just get it done, it would have been done in my mind.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for extensive and very well-informed panel, I must say. I would, Victoria Vdovichenko, Center for Geopolitics, University of Cambridge. Yuliya, I will use your words because you absolutely brilliantly narrowed that to the political contingency. And this term is basically can be used to echoes to many of the panelists' discussion on the coalition of willing, being to some extent now in this political contingency, on understanding on Trump and Putin, let's say, next steps, and that Sir Lawrence Freedman was absolutely brilliant in using it. My question, though, will be how to overcome this political contingency as of the end of 2025 in order understanding that we have election cycles in Europe in 2026, in the United States, and at the same time, Russians are using it as a best momentum to do absolutely amazingly and openly, not only covert operations, hybrid operations, but actually touching the soil very easily and taking away without any kind of legacy and legal consequences on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. Please, gentlemen on that side. Oh.
Thank you. This issue is not just a legal and political, issue. There are reports in the Financial Times, I think, that the drones over Brussels airport are directly linked as a form of pressure on the Belgian government on this matter. Now, is that likely to be true? If it is true, what effect do we think that it will have?
Could you please introduce yourself? Could you please introduce yourself?
I have been Paul Schultz from Birmingham University.
Thank you very much. Robin, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I mean, I think first, during the Biden administration, it took us a minute to realize that those sovereign assets existed in the different places where they did. And then our realization was that we had a much smaller amount of them than Europe did. And if we set a precedent, that Europe would have a reaction to that. And so we did what we did throughout the 4 years of the Biden administration, and that was consult our European allies and partners about what they wanted to do. And the legal arguments that we put forward were not always immediately accepted by our European partners and allies. And it was in the last year of the administration at the Munich Security Conference where we were finally able to sit down with, at that time, Chancellor Scholz of Germany to suggest that we finally had a legal theory of the case of why these assets could be seized and used. And we were met with a great deal of skepticism, not only by Scholz, but by others in the European Union, and maybe less so in the UK, but who were concerned that the seizure of these assets would have implications for the European currency, would have implications for inflation within Europe, and would represent, I believe we were told, a further US attack on Europe's prosperity and even its security. And so we were trying to act in lockstep with our European partners, and the time just wasn't right. I am glad that we've come around now to a realization that perhaps this is something that needs to be done, and I'm glad that Europe is a step closer to that. But again, it's something that we have to continue talking to each other about, because there are, and this is why it's important to have a deliberative process about everything, right? There are potential unforeseen consequences that we have to prepare for, which clearly Belgium is preparing for in different ways. And we also have to get past that fear that we've had since the beginning of this conflict, that any small thing that we do will result in nuclear retaliation or some sort of nuclear option, if it's financial, from Russia. Because the first escalation was Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. That was the escalation, and at some point we do need to respond.
Thank you. Sir Lawrence, can you do in half a minute answer about political contingencies? How can we overcome it?
No, I probably can't. I think the way through this war is a glass half full and glass half empty all the time. I think we risk underestimating just how surprising it is that Europe is as united as it is after all this time. Again, go back to the expectations, which you can see in the Russian media, of the spring, summer of 22, looking forward to the winter, and the Germans going to be freezing because of the energy crunch and so on, and Ukraine fatigue setting in and so on, and it didn't happen. We've kept going, and resources have been found, but it's not enough. And watching the clock there, I'll just say one thing on the drone point. Again, for Russia, it is a form of intimidation, and it's the cyber and it's the information campaigns. We mustn't give Russia more credit than it deserves in these things. If you want to look at when the UK opinion turned against Russia, it was with the Salisbury attacks. They're too crude and they're too blatant, and in the end, it doesn't make. We've got to show resilience against it, and I'm going to stop at that point because it's 11 o'clock.
And here I would like to invite you for a minute of silence. Thank you.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, you can.
I think we should use it. We should be talking about it more. And if it's the case that Russia is engaging in activities, particularly with Baltic, Poland, etc., for airspace with drones or drone aircraft, whether, okay, this is a reason to look at air defences. And if you're going to look at air defences, you don't just want them on the border. It makes sense to have them with a bit of breadth. So why not include Western Ukraine in this? Yeah. I mean, I think we've got to use this more against the Russians. We're too passive with these things. We don't use opportunities to push back.
And this was very much on the table after violation of Polish airspace. Yeah. And Bertrand and Yuliya, I would like you to quickly comment also, because I think this non-conventional dimension of the war is very important. It is, we can see that Europe is under attack, but it's this gray zone between peace and war, which somehow makes it also less urgent, perhaps here in European capitals. And while we should not overestimate, perhaps, the power of Russia to intimidate, there is clearly an impact, and this does bring it. It's a different front. And I'm curious, how do you respond to this? Are these drones flying around Zaventem a way to pressure Brussels, perhaps, on this question?
Yes, it is. So in short, this is something of a variation on the nuclear blackmail argument. It's more or less the same thing. And it's this idea that seizing Russia's reserves would also trigger military escalation or retaliation in Europe or Ukraine as well. But that argument misunderstands both deterrence and the nature of Putin's own calculus. It gets the logic pretty much exactly backwards. Putin doesn't escalate because we act, Putin escalates because we hesitate. His entire strategy depends on convincing the West that we should be afraid of our own power. And so yes, Russia has already escalated in every dimension of this war, militarily, economically, even informationally, while the West has held back repeatedly, especially on the assets, for 3 years, because out of fear of what Russia might do next. And that pattern of self-deterrence has not prevented escalation, it has invited it. And so Putin reads hesitation as weakness. That is why he is sending drones over Brussels airspace. And it's why we are here almost 4 years later. And so repurposing frozen assets is not an act of aggression. It's a lawful, proportionate response to an unlawful war of aggression that actually strengthens deterrence. Escalation is not the risk of action. It's actually the cost of continued inaction, and I would say. And using the assets is actually how you stop escalation and stop Russia from intimidating other European states, by using those assets to end the war.
Thank you. Well, we'll take more questions, and we will start with you, Bertrand, and I also want you to reflect a bit, how Europe is prepared for non-conventional war that Russia is waging. Please, lady here in the second row.
Hi, my name is Emily Prey from the New Lines Institute in Washington. My question is for Robin. We've talked about what the Biden administration did and how Trump doesn't like suffering, doesn't like death, might want a peace deal, doesn't actually understand what peace is. But what is the actual capacity of the U.S. to lead or work with our allies on this, given the complete gutting of the State Department, the destruction of U.S. aid? I mean, I was also in Washington for many years, so I know intimately the offices that were cut and the people that were cut and the knowledge that has been lost that will have generational consequences. So even though Trump might want peace and be pursuing different types of deals, how can the U.S. lead on this when there just isn't the knowledge around him to work on this? Thank you.
Yeah, just one sec. Let's get your mic.
Thank you. Francis Stoney, The Telegraph. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My question is also for Ms. Brooks. Could you just clearly articulate for us exactly what Ms. Harris's policy would have been on Ukraine and how it would have differed on the Biden administration and how it would have differed from Mr. Trump's approach?
Thank you. And can you pass the mic? Yes, right next to you.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful panel. Domitila Sagramoso from the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. I have one quick question to Mr. Buchwalter, because you went into details of the force and the coalition of the willing, but the big question is always what would be the role of the United States in terms of support to this force once deployed. I mean, do we have a bit more detail? Is there some kind of commitment from the United States that they would intervene in case reassurance force in Ukraine after ceasefire is under threat, under attack? And more of a comment to Ms. Brooks. It's true, Europe needs to articulate its vision, but at the moment it feels more like the United States is really not producing a clear vision to Europe. And how does it envisage European security and Ukraine's role in it? So I wonder if you can imagine how this can be sort of developed more clearly in some way or another. Thank you.
Thank you. Competition of non-visions, but let's start with Bertrand.
Now, very quickly on political contingency and asymmetric warfare, I think we've not lived the kind of Salisbury awakening that the UK has been subject to, but you'd remember that the first election, when President Macron got elected, he had to face a smear campaign coming from Russia. So I mean, his realization that Russia was, posing a threat and that it was like a interfering in our political life was very much there from the beginning. But sometimes we feel powerless because indeed it's an asymmetric, and we feel like we are not. It's not an even fight. That we don't have the same tools. But when I see and also reading and listening to Sir Lawrence, Russia has this because it is an autocracy, because Vladimir Putin is living in a parallel reality, has this amazing weakness that it is very hard for the Russians to adapt and to adjust to newer realities. I mean, they stick to their original game plan, and it is very, very difficult for them to adjust their strategy. And we've seen this in the past few months and weeks. Indeed, I mean, it's baffling to what extent Putin was unable to seize this inverted comma opportunity. But that's because I think, as an autocracy, you're not well equipped to have this room for maneuver and this agility to take advantage of those situations. So that's a very edging advantage that we have whenever we think that we are too feeble and then we are weak. We have this comparative edge. And on the US, on the kind of support, I would say very quickly that there is no scenario in which Ukraine loses and in which America wins, or in which America's standing would be preserved. It doesn't exist. So based on this assumption, it is clear that there will need to be U.S. support. This is a support that we've been seeking privately, and in the Americans and the current administration has been part of many of the meetings of the Coalition of the Willing. We have had 11 meetings at the level of leaders since the beginning of the year, and the U.S. were part of those to some of those meetings. EUCOM is part of all the discussion and is fully aware of but the kind of approach that we have developed from the beginning, not that there was unanimity on this, but that for us, at least in France, it was very clear, and probably also in the UK, that we needed to do our homework, and that it was not right to seek support from the US outright before we had done this homework. Mm-hmm. So we've done this homework, we've done the planning, and it's based on this planning that we are seeking US support, not vice versa.
All right, thank you. Robin?
I think the number of questions directed at me at this panel are another sort of underscoring of the need for U.S. officials to come and speak at events like this. And again, I express my regret that there isn't someone here from the administration to do so. And should there have been, I would have still liked to be here, because I think it is important to also see a diversity of views on the same issue. But I welcome all the questions. Thank you for them. I think they're all related. On the question, what is the actual U.S. capacity to lead, I would respond with a question, do you really want the U.S. to lead at this particular juncture in time? This is a conflict on the European continent where we as the United States led to the extent that we could during the Biden administration, because we saw Ukraine's security as linked to Europe's security and Europe's security as linked to American security. But I think it is important for Europe to also see Ukraine as linked to European security, and probably to lead on an issue that takes place on this continent. And I think I would extend that further into areas where I'm more of an expert, like the Western Balkans, where also Europe needs to start leading without waiting for the United States to do so. I myself am a former career State Department official of 21 years who no longer serves that State Department. And I'm very happy to be here. But again, the US capacity to lead right now is confusing, because we don't even know what the policy is, and we're sitting here in this room for 2 hours guessing about it. And for that reason, I would really urge Europe to articulate a vision and hope that the US will support and follow. What is the U.S. commitment to intervene if a ceasefire is under attack? Again, I don't think the U.S. has made such a commitment firmly yet. However, the U.S. remains, at least rhetorically, and I think also in practice, committed to Article 5. And so if Putin is stating that he views international forces on the ground in Ukraine as legitimate targets, Article 5 would then dictate that the United States come in and support our allies in the event that they were attacked. And I think we have, at different levels, at different conferences, considered different options for supporting European boots on the ground in Ukraine, whether that is through intelligence and reconnaissance, whether that is through aerial refueling, whether that is through provision of certain types of equipment. And those things may all change, so it would behoove Europe at some point to articulate a clear vision and lock in that commitment to the extent possible. And I regret, sir, that I can't, I think foreign policy usually doesn't change. There has been this idea for 200 years that politics stops at the water's edge, which means that domestic politics shouldn't affect what you see as your national security. And I think on most of the issues, to include Ukraine, a Harris policy would not have differed much from a Biden policy. It would have differed from a Trump policy for all the reasons that I think you yourself can imagine. One of which was that Kamala Harris was the first high-level U.S. official to go to the eastern flank after the invasion to articulate our ironclad commitment to Article 5, to deliver on both security and humanitarian commitments to the eastern flank, to NATO, and also to Ukraine, and that she was incredibly dedicated to working with the government of Ukraine on governance and on countering corruption and on ensuring that there was a sufficient deterrent to allow industrial activity and economic activity to continue in Ukraine for the people of Ukraine, and to the idea that the U.S. would do nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. In all those ways, perhaps she would have differed from a Trump administration, but on the Ukraine issue and on the commitment to our European allies and partners, I think it would have been largely continuity from the Biden administration.
Thank you, Robin. We're out of time, but I would still like to give concluding remarks to Sir Lawrence and Yuliya from British and Ukrainian perspectives, if you have something to add.
Well, I'm Ukrainian American, but I'm based in Washington, D.C., so I can't speak for Ukraine, but I can give remarks based on my own perspective. That I will say that the politics of fear have driven so much of our decisions, including on Russian sovereign assets. And in order to put ourselves ahead in this war, Europe and Ukraine, we need to start thinking in terms of politics of leadership and finding reasons to do the right thing instead of looking for reasons not to.
Thank you.
I agree with that. I mean, I think the theme of the discussion is we've got to get ahead of on the issues, that we have been too passive. I think the idea that this would lead to nuclear war was crippling when it was never going to happen. When again, if you just looked at what Putin said, as opposed to what Medvedev said, just looked at what, he was very clear about the circumstances in which nuclear weapons would be used, and that would be if there was a direct fight between NATO and Russia. He never envisaged the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Medvedev talked about all sorts of things, but even he was talking about threats to Europe, and we took it far too seriously. So I think we need to get ahead. We need not to stop worrying about what Russia could do to us and think a little bit more about what we can do to Russia.
Thank you. On that note.